Constantinople, because that's Christian. Yeah. Go Constantine. Yeah, it becomes Istanbul, and the Turks take it over in 1450 to 1400s. So, exact same place. It's still a very important port city because it controls the Straits of the Bosphorus, which is the only way into the Black Sea, right? So, if you're going to put something down, it's going to stop basically all of Russia, or that whole landmass, from being able to get into the Mediterranean and get into the Atlantic Ocean. So, it's a very strategic place to put a capital city. He bases it off basically off of Rome. He's like, oh, there's 7 hills in Constantinople. There's not. He says there is to kind of, Rome has 7 hills. Is a very important thing for the Roman city. He bases the layout. He breaks it into different areas the same way Rome's breaking out of. It's the new Rome, right? This is what he calls it. This is his idea for it. Like Rome, anybody who lives, he starts importing a bunch of people to live in Constantinople because nobody's living there right now. Like Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire, he gives them free food to live there. Anybody who lives there gets free food. Anybody who lives there gets free entertainment, so they can go to see the games for free as well. It's just a rival center of power, right? Historians are kind of split if they thought Constantine wanted to kind of move the locus of power in the Roman Empire to the east, or if he was just kind of setting up another one for his own glory. Emperors had always been making giant public building projects, right? So this isn't anything new, but it is new that it's a new capital. And for the history of the church and the history of, empires in general, Constantinople is a very important, it lasts until the 1400s, right? So for about 1,000 years, this is the capital of the Roman Empire. It becomes the capital of especially the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Greek-speaking Roman Empire. And during this time period, there's a deeper split between people who speak Latin and people who speak Greek. And this makes sense, right? Like, there's a pretty big split between us and people living in Mexico, and it's mainly a linguistics, right? Like, most of us don't speak Spanish, most of them don't speak English. There's not much we can really say to each other, literally. And this split kind of begins to happen during this time period. Latin becomes more popular, Greek becomes less popular. So there's a kind of a split that starts happening. We'll talk about that a lot more as the history of the church goes on. It becomes very apparent as the history of the church goes on. There's actually a schism because of it. Like, the church splits because of mainly linguistic difficulties. And it all kind of centers around Constantinople, which is now the new Rome, since Constantine moves there. So 333 AD, Constantine dies, right? He splits up the empire, which is ironic, and he gives it to 4 different parts. He splits it into 4, kind of the way that he found it, made it into 1. He splits it up, gives it to his sons, right? My question to you all is, what do you make of Constantine? What do you make of Constantine, like, as an emperor? Like, what are your thoughts on him? Like, if you were living during this time period, he reigned for 30-something years. That's a really long time for a Roman emperor, for anyone.
Free food.
Free food? Oh,
Sounds like the America today.
yeah.
Giving people away so they'll, a lot of ways, so they'll,
Yeah.
a lot of illegals coming into the country, and it can work both ways. I understand that, but that draw is money. What I kind of see is he's going to Turkey to escape the paganism of Rome, where, and I understand that because of the persecution and stuff, but you can never escape paganism.
Yeah.
You can move, you can do, you can become a monk, but you still deal with your mind, you still deal with other people. So it's never a perfect world. And I understand he was the emperor, so he needed to do what he needed to do, but and he split that kingdom up into 4 parts, and that was part of Nebuchadnezzar's revelation?
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel kind of talks about how like the nations just kind of gives them split up. Like there's not going to be like a huge world power until the very end of time, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I just want to understand, did he split up Constantinople or did he split up Rome?
So good question. Rome controls all of the Mediterranean right now, right? Like it owns from the tip of Spain all the way to the Euphrates, essentially. It's a huge area. Really hard for one person to govern, right? Like it's massive. The population actually has a boom during this time period, especially in the western half of the empire. The eastern half had always had like quite a few people living in it, but the western half, meaning Italy to Spain, doubles in population during this time period. Very hard to manage as a single emperor. Constantine looks at this and he's like, it's very hard for him personally to rule the entire empire himself. So he decides to kind of, it's not de facto that the empire is like, there's an eastern half and a western half. But that's kind of how people start to think. Because of the linguistics things, they're like, well, the Greek-speaking half and then the Latin-speaking half. And then they have different rulers too. And even though it's technically one empire, they have different rulers for each half. So yeah, they kind of, it just naturally kind of happens that they become antagonistic toward each other. But that will become more clear later. Right now, this isn't a huge problem. It becomes a lot more clear in like 600 years that like there's a very big difference between the West and the East.
So he was getting rid of paganism, or he's running away. But then he makes the games again, like the Colosseum games, like killing.
No,
people?
not the Colosseum.
Oh, okay. I didn't know. Like
Hippodrome, like the chariot racing.
Got it. Which is still could be violent.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not as much of.
It especially became violent. Especially whenever the people's team didn't win that they wanted, they would like lynch each other over that.
Yeah.
Yeah. They actually called it like the Second Senate because all the people would meet in the Hippodrome, and then whenever an emperor came onto the throne that they didn't like, they would like rile each other up and then they'd go kill him.
And do this or this.
Oh yeah, well they would like leave they would go find him in like the White House essentially and like lynch him and then they'd put a new person on. Yeah.
Because of the games.
Well, I mean that's just kind of where everybody hung out.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Called it the People's Senate.
So he like kind of died. The sole object of the game wasn't to just see who killed each other.
No, I mean with the chariot racing, it was just chariot racing, right?
Yeah.
Like race horses.
Yeah.
People died because chariot racing is incredibly dangerous, but that wasn't the goal.
Yeah,
of
the goal was
chariot
just
racing.
fast
Yeah.
cars.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. Cool.
And something to watch. You know.
Yeah.
It was what the red team, the white team, the blue team, and the green team.
Really?
Yeah, for like hundreds of years. It was like those four.
Just what the.
Then it became two. It was like only the blue team and the green, or the blue team and the red team. It was like two-party system. Kind of interesting.
Nice one.
I thought that was interesting. Yeah. So Constantine dies, 330 A.D. Shockingly, his sons carry through with his policies. Right? Like they don't convert back to paganism. They don't. They all stay Christian. And carry through with all his, especially his pro-Christian policy. And this is where we really start to see a shift inside of the Christian church in the Roman Empire and in the West, right? So, lots of changes for the church get just put in, and they stick around for a very long time. The Roman emperors, because of the way Constantine interacted with the church, right? Like he called together synods, he called together councils to deal with matters of faith and policy. All the other emperors begin to think that this is just what emperors do, right? Like we are in charge of the Christian church in the way that the Christians themselves are, because we're Christian and we're in charge of the whole world, so we should be in charge of the church as well. They start calling themselves the image of God on this earth. They start calling themselves God's vice regent, ruling the earth. Like part of this is influence from Persia, because the Persian kings called themselves lords of lords and kings of kings and stuff like that. So they're kind of being influenced by that. But also other Christians, like Eusebius, who we were talking about, he's the one who started calling Constantine the image of Jesus on this earth and the vice regent of God on earth.
Oh, the Vicar of Christ. So are we seeing
Almost.
the Pope come to develop?
There, kind of. The Pope develops on the other half. He sees this happening with the Emperor, and the Pope decides to bring his own power into the game too. We'll talk about that soon. But yeah, that's exactly it. There's this temporal mindset that starts kind of working its way into the church. Because the church, the entire empire is Christian. We have a huge shift of pagan people to becoming Christian, right? Now that it's the government religion, all the people in high office are like, okay, well, like in order to stay in office, I got to be a Christian, so go become a Christian, right? So we get a lot of demographic shift in that way. Christianity becomes more and more a upper middle class kind of religion. Up to this point, it was still very much a poor person's religion, but because of this shift inside of the empire, we see it moving towards the upper middle class. We also see a lot of legislation being passed during this time period that is very pro-Christian. So they allow anybody to donate as much as they want, untaxed, to the church. And because we see a lot of wealthier people becoming Christians, a lot of wealthier people are starting to donate large tracts of land to the church. The church starts to aggregate huge swaths of land to itself. Like I said before, the Constantine started giving money to the Christian church to help pay for the bishops and also to help pay for building churches. This continues throughout the rest of the time period. Throughout the rest of this time period in Roman history, instead of the money going to the pagan temples, the money goes to the Christian church. So Christianity not just taking tithe money in from its members, it's also getting government funding as well. It's becoming very wealthy. The bishops become not just religious leaders of this time period, they start to become secular leaders. And this was already kind of incipient in Christianity. A lot of Christians, instead of going to pagan lawyers, they would go to Christians. They'd go to their bishop and be like, hey, can you adjudicate our law, right? And this is kind of in the Bible too, right? Like, don't go to the pagan people. Try to work it out amongst yourselves first before you go into the world, right? So this is found inside of the Bible, but it becomes even more and more. Like now, everybody in the empire is going, because everybody's becoming Christian. So everybody's going to the bishop for legal stuff. So bishops no longer can look after their flock. They have to look after like very legal aspects of just society in general, right? So there's that many legal changes going on. There's also a very important shift in taxation during this time period. I was unaware of it until I started studying it, but it was ruinous. It was terrible what was going on with the taxes during this time. Like we were talking about earlier, that like there was an economic regression before going into Constantine. Well, Constantine tries to fix this. Diocletian before him and Constantine after him. They both try to fix this problem of the inflation and the problem of the economy. What was happening, like we said, Rome and Constantinople both are giving out free food, right? The food's coming from somewhere. Like just literally free food. If you live in Constantinople, you just get free bread. Like, that's just how it worked. The same with Rome. Where does this food come from? It comes from North Africa, Carthage, Numidia, that area, and it comes from Egypt, right? So, kind of like we were saying before, the Numidian martyrs were all peasants. In Egypt, the Coptic people who were being martyred, they were all peasants, right? Like, all the food that they're getting comes from these peasant people. It's a devastating tax on them. They can't afford to give all their food away to these capital cities away from them. And they start running away. They start trying to get to a different field of work because they can't keep up with it. Constantine says, no, like you can't do that. Actually, now, if you are a farmer, you're not allowed to leave your farm fields. Like you are legally, if we catch you leaving it, what they branded them, they're like, you can't leave your farm field, and your sons after you can't leave your farms either. Like you are stuck doing this for the rest of your life. It's essentially slavery. He just made like large swaths of the free population inside of these different areas slaves. But this isn't only for the agricultural workers, it's also for the people working the boats that brought the bread from, or brought the wheat from Alexandria and from Carthage to Rome and Constantinople. They had to pledge their own money. So if the boat sunk, they had to make up all reparations for the bread that got lost, right? So they were like, well, I don't like, and they keep doing it more and more. They're not getting paid for it either. So like, I don't like this, you know. I'm gonna go do something else. No, same thing, like branding. And if you try to leave and do something else, like you're gonna get killed for it, and your sons have to do this too. Same thing for the soldiers. Like we said, before in the Roman Empire, soldiers all came from just the normal folk, like me and you, normal citizens who thought like this is for the glory of our empire, like we're gonna go fight these wars. Now that we're about 600 years into the empire, they're not doing any glorious fighting. It's all just border, keeping up with the borders. There's no glory in that. Nobody really wants, no citizens want to do it. They're not taking over any pagan nations anymore, so they can't press the people that they conquer into the military services, which they've been doing. So now, whoever's in the army, they brand. They're like, you have to stay in this. And your sons after you have to stay in this. If you leave, same thing, we kill you. Just vast levels of misery going on this. And also, the middle management inside of the governmental bureaucracy. The same thing happened. Where before they had tax collectors, like we see in the Bible, where they would go and they would collect the taxes and they kind of get a cut out of it and all that. Well, Constantine and Diocletian decide that no, we're going to get rid of that. We're going to make a governmental kind of middle person who's going to do all the tax collecting. But if they don't get all the taxes that they're supposed to get, they have to pay from their own pocket. And they're not getting paid. So before, people would take this just for kind of the glory of working in the public service, but now that the taxes are higher and the people are all leaving and there's less money in general, nobody wants this job. It's called the curial job. Same thing, branded, you have to state it. Large swaths of the not upper class but lower class are becoming very disaffected with the empire in general, right? And who can blame them, right? Like these taxes are ruinous. Oh, and on top of that, every 5 years that an emperor was enthroned, there was a giant circus, giant festivities that happened in Rome and Constantinople, so another tax. They said this tax is way worse than people would sell their children into slavery in order to pay it, or worse. It was just like terrible taxation on the lower classes during this time period. On top of that, like we said before, the Christian church was becoming very affluent, and really everybody was Christian. So the Christian church begins to wonder, like, what's the beat? Like, what are we doing here? Like, as a church, before this, you're suffering under persecution, you're spreading the gospel to people, witnessing all that. Now that everybody's Christian, then what's the method? What's the means of the Christian life, right? So yeah, I'd ask you guys, what would you do now that you're in this kind of whole empire's Christian?
Are we upper class or lower class?
Good question.
Well, just to clarify too, everybody's like Christian.
Yeah.
Not everybody's Christian.
Yeah.
Just like everyone in England is part of the Church of England.
Right. Yeah, very similar.
Okay.
Eat, drink, and be merry.
Okay. All right.
Well, you wonder if they were teaching the new believers anything, or if they just became Christian, left the area, and went and converted a bunch of other people.
Yeah, I guess probably here.
Maybe they were limited in in the knowledge they had, so they didn't.
Or maybe it's way easier for I don't know if this is the right word, but schisms to happen or heresy to be spread, because if not everybody's genuinely having faith. Even people who have genuine faith disagree on things. So
now there's no persecution to kind of make it so you don't.
Well,
Before you could kind of ignore it, but
or
now.
all the made all the kind of secondary things not matter, like you said. So the persecution did, but now since it's popular,
doesn't sound like there's much anything spiritual
Growth,
going on here.
Yeah.
It just seems very political, and and I wonder, religion is, especially the Christian religion, does have a large, we are taught to respect the magistrate and to take care of ethical concerns, but there's also a level of like abide in me, these kind of things. And so I see, I don't know, there's probably a hunger for that amongst people. And I can see that. We're talking about monks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So was there persecution against people who didn't identify as Christians?
Yeah.
Okay.
This was not so much right now, but definitely as it progresses.
Okay.
Yep.
Or even like if you were a farmer and you were branded and had to stay at your farm like as a slave basically by your Christian nation, I feel like that would just,
Something's
if you were
off.
those kind of people, like, I mean, we meet people like that today, like I wouldn't serve a God like that, so
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine the thought would be similar for those people at least.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a messy time period. But, like Lee said, there was a reaction against this. It was in the form of monasticism. As we said before, asceticism or like rigorous moral life inside of the church has always been kind of a calling card for the church. You know, like not having sex outside of marriage and marriage always being within the marriage bonds. This was like a very novel idea, especially to the Romans. And it was always something that the church could point to and be like, look, this is like how we operate. This is a part of our life, right? So, this kind of, it's called asceticism. I'll write it down. We'll probably be saying it a lot. So, yeah, there we go.
No one will question.
I'm questioning. Yeah, harsh, taking control of your own body so that you don't fall into passions or like physical desirous sins, right? Asceticism. It's always been a part of Christianity. Jesus talks about it, right? You know, like don't fall into the pleasures of this world. There's always been a kind of strict moral ethic inside of the church. Well, especially the poorer elements of Christianity during this time, the ones who are being ruinously taxed by fellow Christians, they're beginning to wonder, like, is this Christianity? Like, is what I'm living right now what Jesus says? And because a lot of them can't keep up with the ruinous taxation, they start to walk away and start doing other things. And really, there's two groups that are gonna come up around this time. One is monasticism, which carries on until even now, and one of them was called the Circumcellians inside. We talked about them a little bit before, I think 2 class periods ago. I'll mention them again just because it's kind of coming out of the same idea of asceticism. They were in North Africa, or near Carthage, right? Like we said, this was the same area that... I'll write that a little better. Circumcellians. They were in the area that was being taxed very harshly by Rome to get a lot more bread so that Rome could have free bread. They were also the same area that Donatism was a part of. So a lot of the Circumcellians were Donatists. They were part of a schismatic portion of the church. And a lot of them were the poor peasants. A lot of them ran away because of the taxation. They lived very austere, ascetic lives. They would fast for large portions of the time. A lot of them were found to be living inside of tombs around the martyrs' graves from Diocletian's persecution that was only, 60 years ago. A lot of them knew him. They would live there. They would meet together. They didn't like the Donatists. They didn't like the Christians. They were living kind of in their own communities, and during certain time periods, they would all break out, and if they found like a Christian church or a Donatist church, they would break the altars down, kick everybody out. Kind of terrorists to a large degree. It was more of an attempt at social reform through violent methods, right? Like they would attack magistrates, they would attack people of wealth as well. It was an attempt to bring the equity and justice of the heavenly kingdom onto this earth, like I said, through violent means. Didn't work. We don't see any Circumcellians around anymore, but I would say the mentality kind of sticks around. Like there's always an attempt at violent reform inside of the Christian community, right? Like we could say Malcolm X in the 1960s, right, where he was trying to bring about reform to violence, stuff like that. Yeah, so that was one half, not very, doesn't stay around, but it's in North Africa, which I just found interesting because, yeah, that's where the greatest discontent was. And then the other half, just monasticism, we'll call it that. This isn't what really they called themselves, but this is what they have become to be called, so this is what I'm going to call them. The father of monasticism is considered to be Anthony the Great. He was an Egyptian. He actually was alive in 270 AD, that's when he was born. And his life is incredibly interesting. At the age of 20, his mom and his dad dies. He was in a kind of wealthier upper class, so he has a lot of land, a lot of money. He inherits it all, and his younger sister. He lives with that for about 5 years. He takes care of affairs, all that kind of stuff. And then he starts to wonder, yeah, is this all Christianity is? He reads in the Gospels, if you would be a member of me, sell all you have and give it to the poor. He takes this literally, so he takes all of his land, sells it to the poor, he takes all of his money and gives the money to the poor. He takes all of his money, gives it to the poor. He gets his sister and has her go live with other Christians. And he himself goes away into a graveyard, and he begins to live there. For about 5 years, he's in this graveyard. He's being tempted, it says, by demons, having hallucinations about the devil, combating it through this rigorous ascetic life. He's not eating. He's eating like a loaf of bread a day and drinking water. And he eventually brings that even farther down to less than a loaf of bread a day. After 5 years of living in this graveyard, he decides to go in even further into the desert. Now, in Egypt, it's a lot easier to get into the desert. Actually, in Africa in general, very easy to go to the desert. A lot of Africa, especially northern Africa, is desert. Egypt, particularly, if you just move like a mile or two out from the Nile, like you're in just uninhabitable wasteland. This is one of the reasons why it's very common in Egypt for this to happen, because it's very easy to get into the wilderness in Egypt. Just walk like 10 minutes and you're there, right? So he decides to go out, but he goes 50 miles out of Alexandria. He finds this old Roman fort, kind of holes up in this Roman fort, and he lives there for 20 years. He doesn't leave it. He doesn't step a foot outside of the fort's walls. He begins to get a reputation as a holy man. So people, they would come visit him, they'd throw food over to him, and that's how he would eat, and that's how he would survive. Other discontents during this time period start to hear about it, and they start putting up huts around this fort, and they're like, hey, be our spiritual director. No. Be our spiritual director. No, for 20 years. There's a big old tent city, not big old, but there's a probably around 100, 200 people around this fort now, in the middle of the wilderness, trying to get him to be the spiritual director. Finally, he says yes. He opens the doors. They expect him to come out looking like, just someone who hasn't been eating. Apparently, he looks fine, very healthy, all there in his head. He creates a rule or like regulations for how all these different people should live together in community while also spurning the world. It's considered the father. He's considered the father of monasticism for this because he manages to find a way to have all these people kind of live together in harmony while also spurning the world. Inside of monasticism, there's this comes in later, but it's incipient during this time period. It's found in this time period, not fully stated, but just kind of assumed that you're going to be totally obedient to the people in charge of you, or your master. So if you're under St. Anthony, you're going to be completely obedient to him. You can do whatever he says. You're not going to have any belongings. And if you do, it's just very minimal, like a leather coat and a walking stick, and that's like all you have. And then, of course, chastity, right? Like there's no any kind of sexual obligations. You can't be married. You can't do any of that. So in modern monasticism, it's obedience, poverty, and chastity. It's like the three kind of main crutches of monasticism. It's found during this time period, not directly stated, like I said, but it's all there. And it blows up. Like this kind of way of life, even though it happened kind of before Constantine, especially after Constantine and the whole empire converts, large portions of the population start to go to monastics and to try to find spiritual direction for them. Because it's a way of life that isn't very different, you know? Like, everybody's Christian. Well, if everybody's Christian, then, like, who are we looking to be our leaders? If everybody's kind of living the same life. You see these people out in the middle of the desert, and they're healing people out there. They're combating devils out there. Jackals come into their cells and try to eat them and then walk away tamed. Like, this is crazy things happening. Or at least stated crazy things happening. So they begin to draw a lot of people. Around, honestly, 380 AD to 400 AD, there's a monk called Pachomius. I actually was reading his book yesterday. It's lives. It's called a hagiography. It's like a hagiography, meaning holy words. Hagiography. It's basically lives of the saints or lives of the monks. Yeah, they're wild. I'll tell you. It's worth a read just for like the way people thought back then. Very distinctly different than the way we thought. The way that this really emboldened people to live holy lives back then. And reading it now, it's just like one story. I forget the name of the lady. I'll just say Maria because that makes sense to me. But for 10 years, she went into a coffin, holed herself into the coffin, and drilled a hole in it so people could feed her through it. She lived in there for 10 years and then died. And this was like holy literature.
Sounds like torture.
Yeah, that was my thoughts. I was like, what? Read that again, excuse me? It was like a paragraph in the book. She was like, somebody lusted after me whenever I was young, and I don't want to cause anyone to stumble, so I'm just going to... I was like, all right. You know, there's another person called Simeon. He was another holy man. This one was in Syria. Again, this is another area that's very easy to walk off into wilderness. He goes out in the wilderness. People start coming to him. He isn't one of the ones that likes talking with the pilgrims who come to him. So he makes a little pillar about like 4 meters high. So that's 10, 15 feet high. And he sits on top of it to get away from them. And they keep coming. Like that kind of just makes him even more popular. So then he built another one, like 10 feet high, or so he's like 20 feet high. More people come. So then he goes he's like 30 feet on this pillar, chained to this pillar. And people can bring him food and he draws it up on a little cord and he eats it. And he has like a little latrine on the end that he can do what he needs to do off that end. And he's just like out in the elements for like, I don't know, 20, 30 years and then dies, right? Like just very right. Very strange, right? Very interesting. This is the spirit, but this is a spiritual revival in the church during this time period. People go and see these people and they are condemned for their own way of life. They see these people living this very extreme way of life and they're like, well, you know, like, there's one story where this lady goes in to one of the monks and she gives him like, I don't remember the money is like 200 silver denarii. I don't know how much money that is nowadays. A lot of money, you know, probably in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But she gives it to this monk and he's like, oh, thank you. The monk gets another guy. He's like, hey, distribute this to the monasteries down there because they need the money more than we do. And she's like, that was like, you know, $500,000. He was like, okay. If you wanted to impress me, you didn't. And if you wanted to impress God, you just failed because it says to not let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. And, you know, like if I had heard that, because her mentality was like, I'm trying to like buy my way into heaven. And this monk is just like, nope, like that's not what you do. So it's a kind of conflicted way of things. I would say the majority of the normal people like me, if I were to go to see a monk, they acted they were spiritual advisors. So they would just give them general spiritual tips on how to live their life. And generally, like that story, it was fairly apt, often very blunt, kind of spiritual direction that the church probably needed at this time. But yeah, this became huge throughout the history of the church. Stuck around, and honestly, we'll see it later on, but it became one of the main methods of not just witnessing to the world at large, like monastic groups, because they always want to be alone. They go into the wilderness, and then while they're living in the wilderness, they cultivate the wilderness, and then the wilderness becomes actually livable, and then people start to move in around the monasteries. They become a very formative part of Christianity, especially in the west of the empire. But it starts around this time. My question to you is, what would you do if you had a child who was like, I'm going to go become a monk?
Like right now, or if I was living then?
Then. It's like new, you know?
Yeah.
I'd probably be like, they won't last.
Okay. I'll welcome you
Go
back.
ahead, they won't last.
Watch. Yeah.
So the monks, they do read scripture.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
They would do services. That's a good point. They do services at least Saturday and Sunday, often more times. And they would say, like, if you would go into these monasteries, you'd hear all the monks in their cells, like, chanting the Psalms, like, together, like, all day. And then they would go out and work during the day. They would eat. They would have to get the grain for their own community, so they'd go out and work during the day, get the food, bring it in. They'd all eat together. They would usually read scripture during this time period, what they're eating, and then go to bed. And then wake up at 12 o'clock and do a service, and then go to bed. Just do that all day.
And they were the reason why we have the scriptures, partly, because they would copy it.
wrote
And,
them, yes.
That's right.
They wrote them, copied them.
Oh.
so they weren't completely, like...
Not all of them were Simeon the Stylite. We'll
Yeah.
say that, yes. Not all of them would, like,
Live on a pole.
lock themselves into a casket and...
Yeah.
Well,
most of them are pretty normal. Yeah, or pretty normal. I mean, abnormal, because not everybody becomes a monk. But for a monk, pretty normal.
But it's not in the Bible. I mean, it tells you it's better. I think Paul said for me to remain single.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have to develop all this stuff around it?
Mm-hmm.
It just makes it very complicated, and it draws attention, and
One thing they don't
so
want.
it defeats the purpose. I think
Yeah.
sometimes because of that. So.
It is interesting, though.
But
'cause-
if you want to marry, that's okay too.
Mm-hmm. I don't think they would say it's wrong to marry.
Yeah.
That becomes more in vogue later, where like marriage is put down. During this time period, the monks generally are just kind of like, if you're gonna marry, you're gonna marry. Like, do it.
But they wouldn't.
But they wouldn't. Yeah, they're like, this is not what I should do.
And I think, like you're saying, it's not really a structure in the Bible that we see or even encouraged, but it definitely was, like, God used it. It's just funny how God uses things that...
We get so twisted.
Yeah, but God will still use...
Yeah.
He still used the monks
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
to bring spiritual vitality, and sounds like at
Well,
least.
really, this is all we got. He's got to work with.
Is that
If he's gonna use
yeah,
that.
the circuses,
Yeah.
so I'm not gonna use them.
Yeah.
When did Anthony the Great live?
270 to 320.
Okay, so
He became like a monk around 270. Athanasius actually knew him. We'll talk a little bit more about Athanasius tomorrow. He's a very seminal figure inside of Christianity during this time period. Very important for talking about the Trinity correctly. That's his main thing. But he actually met Anthony, and he wrote a history of Anthony's life that became very influential. It got translated into Latin almost like 5 years after Athanasius wrote it. It gets spread across the entire empire. Kind of blows up the entire thing about monasticism because it talks about like Anthony's life, like basically what I told you, with a lot more crazy that goes on in it, right? Like Anthony goes out into the desert and sees a centaur and a satyr. Don't know what to make of that, honestly. Like I read that, I'm like, I'm sure he saw things in the desert, like I'm
No
sure.
food,
Right.
water,
Yeah, right.
I'm sure he saw things.
Yeah.
a
Like,
lot of things out there.
Peyote buttons.
right, I'm sure he saw a centaur. I'm sure he did. whether or not it was a demon attacking him. Like, there's just a lot of stuff in the literature that I was very confronted with when I read it. Like, I was very, I don't know, I was just kind of like, man, like, because I don't think they're not meaning to lie,
Well,
you know? Like,
Aaron, what bothers me is it distracts from the gospel. It's
but when everybody says they're Christian,
Yeah. I don't know, everyone was drawn because of the Spirit. They were, one
it was
leader
the
was saying
thing
you
to
gotta
do.
be it, and
It was-
so they be it, but,
Yeah.
how deep is it?
and then of course the economic, even with monks, like the economic aspects of it, like a lot of the people who left were like poor peasants who had to sell their farms because they couldn't afford the taxation on them anymore. And then what do you do?
Where do you go?
Where do you go? You go to the monastery. Like it, and it became also like children, orphans who were
Yes.
born, like they would be given to the monasteries, and the monastics would take care of them. This wasn't really right now. This is very much later, like 100, 200 years. The monasteries became centers for this because they weren't taxed, and they were often given large amounts of land, so they became a kind of a shelter in that way for the poor and the very needy, widows, orphans, stuff like that. So,
I think thinking about what Holly said though, where do you, as you've studied the literature, where do you see like the gospel impulse being continued through? Just like in the words of the text,
the gospel impulse
of like you must repent to be saved.
Like the witness, the
Yeah.
conversion, or
Yeah.
like during this time period, they're still converting large swaths of the pagan population to Christianity. So pagan meaning like in modern day, what would that be? North of Greece, like Hungary kind of area. There's still a lot of barbarians that are living inside of this area that haven't been churched. So people will go into them. One of them, Ophilas, he translated the Bible into their language, and was able to convert large swaths of they're called the Goths, but he converted large swaths of them to Christianity. It was Arian Christianity, which makes it very, yeah, it's like, I don't know. But he does convert large portions of them. And then there's like a whole host like in Scandinavia and that area that later than this, probably around 400, 500 AD, they start getting converted in larger numbers.
So there's like missions work.
Oh yeah, and the monks are usually the ones doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The especially when the Pope becomes more important, he'll like take monks and be like, you like go convert like millions of people, and they'll go do it, and they do it. Like they go in there and like convert an entire swath of like hundreds of thousands of people.
And it's like, sure, we don't have.
I don't know exactly what they were saying.
Yeah, and we don't have
Convert to what?
we don't have monks, and we don't have the Pope, but we have like.
Yeah.
But we're Christians
I
because
believe it is.
the
Our chief
Lives in
converted.
a
Yeah.
casket with
It's hard to
a
know.
hole in it.
yeah.
Hard to know like what exactly their faith looked like
You
Yep.
can't do
during this time period.
But and that stuff is just not recorded.
Yeah, less recorded. Like the
They're not
general
really
faith
asking-
of the common man. Hard to know.
They're not really asking questions.
Yeah.
They're not
They're not
talking
writing
about
books.
it like we're talking about it, and they're not. It's more like get them to church.
Get them in a church. The sacraments are very important during this time period.
Make sure they eat the Eucharist.
Yep, the Eucharist being the means of grace during this time. Baptism being the remission of sins, so it washes away your sins completely. Yeah. Oh, I also forgot to mention, Constantine does get baptized. He wasn't baptized up to this point. He does get baptized on his deathbed. So there you go. Yeah, very.
So
It's like the deathbed conversion of the late 80s. Because during this time period, the baptism was seen as the removal of sins, right? So he was like, well, I'm just going to wait till... So, like,
So
I can get them all, like, get rid of them all at one go. And he does, so... And that was kind of common during this time period, too, just because of the way they thought about baptism, really. In the same way, like, the deathbed conversion happens in modern times, right? Like, when people are like, well, I'm just going to hold out till I'm on my bed and I'll say the prayer and then I'll go to that kind of mentality. Same thing. I can't really blame anything back then for that. Like, that kind of psychology is still found everywhere. Yeah.
Still deal with it.
Well, we have, one thing we do have is a lot of different churches.
Mhm.
So to me, it just creates more people with their own idea. Not that they hold to some of the tenets of the gospel, but there's just all the differences, and that distracts people who aren't Christian from becoming Christian. It's like, why do you have all these churches?
Yep.
And you're all have your own beliefs.
Oh yeah. John talks about that, right? You'll know we're Christians by our love and by our unity too.
Yeah.
Be one as I and the Father are one, and that hasn't been the case, really, ever. So
The more people you get involved, the more complicated things become.
yeah.
And so it's so hard to stay on the central point and another thing is I think people like to show you how intelligent they are. So they create all these different things. And
Has to be
I
new.
thought of this. You didn't think of that, but then they will think of something else.
Right.
And it's
My system, my idea.
Yes.
The nice thing
Man
is,
vaulting himself up to he can't ever attain it compared to who the Lord is.
I think of, because it's like, man, we just can't, we need to get back to that gospel unity, like people believing in the truth. But it's like, man, Peter and Paul got at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
yes.
even the apostles themselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's not what we should do, but it's not surprising that we do.
That it does happen.
But we still should try to fight against it.
Yeah. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Very interesting.
Monks.
Well, do you know that